And I am so excited to be able to welcome you all to the first session in the Anti-Racist Community Engagement Principles and Practices virtual speaker and workshop series. This series is designed to explore how people are putting anti-racist principles into practice at their institutions and in communities. For the past year, I've had the immense pleasure of working with the editors of this book through their fellowship with Campus Compact. And so I can assure you that you're in really good hands today. And so with that, I will hand it off to both Christina and Cynthia to get you started on the rest of your hour together.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, again to the first fall virtual author, speaker, and workshop series event. Over the course of the fall and spring, we authors and editors are breathing life into our recently released book, Anti-Racist Community Engagement Principles and Practices. This month, we are focused on the first principle, counteracting the persistence and impact of racism on our campuses and in our community engagement, reframing our institutional and pedagogic practices. Our work in all cases is to use the shared language of the principles to showcase examples, how chapter authors are making distinct choices to confront and dismantle whiteness within institutional structures and in our campus community collaborations. With that, allow me to do some introductions and invite you all to introduce yourself in the chat with your role, your institution, and then I'll provide a little bit more of an overview of the book and its purpose. My name is Christina Santana. I have had the privilege of being the lead editor and project manager of this book. I am an associate professor of English at Worcester State University in Massachusetts. I co-edited the first section of Principle 1 with my co-facilitator, Cynthia Lynch, who is the executive director of the Center for Civic Engagement and the Frederick E. Berry Institute for Politics at Salem State University. I'm also very happy to introduce our speakers today. They are a few of the authors of Chapter 1, the title of which is the same as their talk today, How to be an Anti-Racist Researcher. They are two faculty members and a doctoral student who have worked to establish a platform for fostering discussions about anti-racism and decolonization in the context of research practices with the ultimate goal of driving positive societal transformation. Please join me in welcoming Meagan Call-Cummings, who is an associate professor of research methods. She's hailing from Johns Hopkins University School of Education. Also with us is Alicia J. Cooper Ellis. She's a doctoral student of higher education and educational research methodologies at George Mason University. And we also have Sharrell Hassell-Goodman, who is faculty in the School of Integrated Studies, also from GMU. Okay, I'll quickly provide an overview of the book for those who are not familiar with it. Then Cynthia will do the same for Principle 1, so you have a sense of what the principle entails. And then we'll turn it over to our speakers. It's important to know that the book is the culmination of years of work and dialogue with colleagues committed to anti-racist community engaged actions regionally and across the country. Over the last 4 years, the 8 co-editors prepared grants, developed curriculum and programs, wrote policies and protocol, and founded a regional consortium, all to move our campuses towards more equitable community engagement and fuller recognition of faculty, students, communities of color, Indigenous communities doing anti-racist community engaged work. This included the development of the anti-racist community engagement principles that became the basis of the book. That project focused on better understanding and aligning the needs of students and community partners. It took place over the period of 7 months. It included teams at 4 campuses across the state of Massachusetts, piles of literature on anti-racist teaching, learning, and research, as much data as we could get to understand how individual institutions understood and responded to the needs and experiences of students that were minoritized, and then focus groups with students and community partners at each campus. The effect of that work is a series of statements organized into 4 parts or principles that comprehensively capture and define what anti-racist community engagement looks like when the voices of students and community partners are centered. Those 4 principles form the structure of the book. The purpose of the book is to build on the wisdom of the principles by revealing the groundswell of work already underway to prioritize anti-racist values and that pivot away from traditional higher ed-centric and white savior ways of doing community-engaged teaching, research, and practice. The journey to the final 22 chapters that you can read in the book was undertaken by pairs of co-editors, each composed of 1 BIPOC editor and 1 white editor, who assumed responsibility for editing chapters related to one of the 4 principles. Overall, the chapters demonstrate how the authors implement one or more of the anti-racist principles in their own work. At no more than 2,500 words each, The chapters are also aimed at ensuring a wide variety of stakeholders can gain insights in a concise format. The chapters are structured by first outlining a case, then the practices the authors use to address the case issues, and finally, the connections their work has to broader context of pedagogical, curricular, institutional, and community change. The 4 sections of the book demonstrate efforts taken at the level of the institution, which is our focus today, intra and interpersonally through critical reflection, through intentional learning and course design, and finally through cultivating compassionate, reflective classrooms. So with that, I'll ask Cynthia to tell us more about principle number 1 before we hear from our speakers.
Super. Thank you, Christina. And I want to just thank you just in public here for your leadership on this book. While we co-edited section 1, Christina really shepherded this book from the thoughts in our mind to the books you're all reading, hopefully in your institutions and at your homes. So with that, I'm going to discuss Principle 1 today and then turn it over to our authors. Principle 1 is counteracting the persistence and impact on racism on our campuses and in our community engagement. It's the reframing of our institutional and pedagogical practices. As with all 4 of the principles, each have several bullets that dig deeper into the meaning of the principle and its place within anti-racist community engagement. Principle 1 has 5 bullets that I want to share with you, and it primarily focuses on our communities, our students, and works to shift the faculty and institutional consciousness about white supremacy as it pertains to community campus collaborations. The five bullets included in Principle 1 are that it recognizes that the burden of anti-racist training can no longer rest alone on the shoulders of students and educators of color. White faculty and the institution at large must commit time and focus to developing anti-racist practices and structures. It fosters collaboration with communities that is driven by and responsive to needs identified by community partners, rather than being overdetermined by the institutions and the perspectives that emerge from the university. It rejects working on to instead working with a community, positioning community partners as equal in the intellectual project, including identifying research questions or problems to be solved, designing methods to analyze these questions, and creating solutions. It also repudiates ideologies of white saviorism or charity that position minoritized communities as in need of saving or rescuing by faculty and students within the university, and prepares white students to enter and engage with communities without these mindsets. And finally, it decenters whiteness by challenging its construction through highlighting the wealth of knowledge communities of color possess about their own community. In essence, Principle 1 is about shifting power dynamics, lifting up and valuing the voices and perspectives of community instead of the university. And it's not an easy task, but it is an essential task. You'll notice as you read chapter 1 that there's a shift in how projects are designed and thought about, with communities identifying the needs. You'll even see the struggles that universities encounter while trying to make this shift, and the different avenues they take to persist in centering community identifying needs, and why it's worth the institutional struggles. You'll see the centering of community knowledge as the driver of the projects in this chapter. Whose knowledge is relevant is critical to anti-racist community engagement, and that means decentering of whiteness. And it is a big shift in higher ed, as faculty and frankly institutions of higher ed for centuries have thought they are the experts. However, this shift is essential to authentic anti-racist community engagement. You'll also notice excellent replicable practices for working with communities to develop these equitable anti-racist partnerships. In these chapters, you'll see successes, you'll see challenges, You'll see do-overs and the desire to follow through and develop true equitable relationships with community. And also woven throughout, you'll see the desire to have sustainable and equitable campus community partnerships throughout, and the fact that campus leaders must rewrite and reframe institutional policies and practices in order for this to exist. To close, while Principle 1 chapters primarily emerged from or were inspired by the pandemic and racial reckoning in the spring of 2022, it is clear that they were not implemented in a performative or one-and-done manner. All the projects model thoughtful responses to the acknowledgement of racism and its impact in the context of people working together, bringing others along to effectively institutionalize this work in the community and on our campuses. So now I would like to turn it over to our authors, Sharrell Hassell-Goodman, Alicia J. Cooper Ellis, and Meagan Call-Cummings, who will share their work that help researchers move beyond normative research practices to conduct more equitable research regardless of the discipline. And with that, I will turn it over to our wonderful authors.
Thank you so much. We have some slides that we'll share. Thank you, and I'll get my screen situated. So thank you, Christina and Cynthia, for that introduction. Today, we're going to offer just some brief glimpses into the chapter that we wrote together, along with acknowledging our co-authors who are not here today, Dr. Rob Graham, who's a clinical professor and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Maryland in African Studies, and Dr. Marvin Powell, who is an associate professor of research methods at George Mason University, where we all connected on this chapter. So next slide. Today, we're gonna just kind of briefly introduce the chapter and talk about some main points, and then invite discussion and questions after our chat. So really, we started with this idea that research-intensive institutions, including our own George Mason University, are charged with the creation and sharing of high-quality research, right? And the preparation and training of practitioners and scholars. But of course, all of us see examples time and time again of how systemic racism has worked against knowledge creation processes that are grounded in inclusive practices. So within the context of higher education, there's been a trend to shift policy and practice, but few really focus on research as practice. And we see this as a missed opportunity, because research is a tool to both address and redress oppressive and inequitable social systems and structures, including racism, but of course, other social systems and structures as well. So as such, faculty members and doctoral students, including the authors here, but also others at George Mason University, came together in 2020 to create a space to encourage and facilitate discussions of anti-racism and decolonization in the context of our research practices. So as alluded to in our introduction, in the summer of 2020, administrators at our university sort of magically began to pay more attention to questions of racial injustice writ large, but specifically in the context of our institution. All of us authors on the chapter had engaged anti-racist and anti-oppressive principles in our own research and praxis, and we had worked together already to further that research in our own department. But of course, by that point, we had really received insufficient support from those in positions of power. Yet at the moment of summer 2020, with such attention paid to anti-racism after the murder of George Floyd, there came this moment of interest convergence, right? So it seemed that at that moment, it was in the interest of, frankly, often white administrators to now be on the side of explicit anti-racism and to sort of prove that in many ways, but particularly in financial ways. So one day in the fall of 2020, we were in a department meeting and our department chair asked us, sort of what could we do to facilitate an anti-racist approach or anti-racist goals within our program. Our program was a research methods one. And so as a group, many sort of turned to look at each other and seemed to be somewhat at a loss of how a research methods program could offer anything in this space, right? We just did methods. Methods is neutral, right? Of course, we all know differently. So during this meeting, I suggested that we perhaps hold a workshop or a series of workshops for our colleagues and students at Mason to support those interested in crafting research agendas that allow them to engage in anti-racist research methods. We have received approval from our department chair, and I reached out to colleagues and students, including the authors on this chapter, specifically Sharrell and Alicia, who already specialized in anti-racist community-engaged research methods. And we worked together to develop this workshop series, which became known as How to Be an Anti-Racist Researcher. So I'll talk just briefly about kind of how we developed the workshops and what the curriculum included, and then Sharrell and Alicia will turn to sort of what this means in practice. So the series engaged a transdisciplinary community of scholars, both BIPOC and white, to learn anti-racist community-engaged research practices that explicitly challenged the centering of whiteness and dominant, epistemologies in research. We built on the principles of anti-racist community engagement to do this. We developed anti-racist research principles to ensure that workshop participants anchored their understanding of anti-racist research methods in a broader understanding of the implications of claiming an anti-racist research agenda. We intentionally developed the workshops in collaboration with participants, faculty, graduate students, and others interested in the series. So we really wanted to avoid a predetermined institutional perspective or agenda. In addition, we offered a theoretical background, and we also offered concrete opportunities to move beyond normative research practices towards specific changes participants could make in their own work. So the first workshop, we had 3, was called What is Anti-Racist Research? And in that workshop, we introduced and defined anti-racist research with participants. We talked about how anti-racist research takes an anti-deficit perspective, that it decenters whiteness as the primary or majority view, and reframes research questions from what's wrong with people to what's wrong with structures and systems. Really, through this one, we wanted to help participants consider all aspects of the research process. So we offered suggestions and examples of anti-racist research, from forming research questions all the way to sharing findings. During the second workshop, titled How Do I Establish a Research Agenda Using an Anti-Racist or Decolonial Lens, we explored frameworks, methods, and data sources to challenge principles within methods that seek to dispossess BIPOC communities of knowledge. We centered explicit instruction in specific community-engaged and participatory research methods. And we really focused on how these methods, like photo voice, ripples of change, priority card sorting, and story circles and storytelling, how these methods can create opportunities for power sharing within the research process and highlight the wealth of knowledge communities of color possess about their own communities. And then our third workshop was titled Navigating Constraints and Locating Possibilities. So we really wanted to move beyond the idea that critical community-based work is focused on sort of locating deficits, even within systems, and really think about points of possibilities. So in this workshop, we worked to interrupt and decenter whiteness by asking participants to identify aspects of the research process, from the conceptualization of the project to sharing findings, that were most problematic in foiling racist practices. We asked for volunteers from among the workshop participants that had already been participating to offer their own research as cases that we could then workshop together. So we, one of the people who worked with us, who is not an author on this chapter, but Giovanni Dazzo, created a guiding framework for these conversations, which we'll share with you in the chat today, and we also share online through our chapter. This was called an individual action plan for change. It's a tool to disrupt racist and colonial research practices specific to one's own research. So during this workshop, participants and facilitators use this tool to guide our conversations in committing to anti-racist research and to consider concrete ways they and we all could interrupt whiteness in research. For example, we talked about intentionally referencing and citing the work of minoritized scholars, including community members, even family members in research, and also taking anti-racist and decolonial approaches to sharing our work with others. So now Sharrell will turn to a discussion of how we created and integrated community in this work.
Thank you, Meagan, for that thorough explanation of the workshops. And I'm so glad to also share in the chat with you a link to look at the workshops in a little bit more detail. One thing that we had the opportunity to do was to record them. So if you actually want to watch the workshops that were recorded, there were only points where we did pause it if it was more personal discussion and we did breakout groups, but you do get the full amount of information in all three of the workshops through this link. So I want to offer that to you if that could be a resource that you might find to be helpful. So in these series of workshops, one thing that was really nice is that we had an opportunity and a space for graduate students and faculty, both new and seasoned, to be able to develop a community and work together. This was really important for us outside the content confines of the academic spaces, particularly classrooms, where that power dynamic is one that's difficult to navigate and graduate students don't feel as comfortable connecting with faculty. Similarly, where faculty sometimes are navigating the process of tenure and don't want to be vulnerable in spaces when they're talking about their research agenda. And so this space was an opportunity to develop community without some of that worry or feeling of that folks are watching you. The other thing that was helpful about this space is that established scholars could be novices, right? And so you could rethink your approaches to methods. So in a lot of times you want to take a risk or try methods and approaches that are more inclusive in nature, but it's difficult to abandon those ideologies and expectations that are really fundamental and prioritized within your specific disciplines. And so this was a space to kind of undo that. Additionally, some of the ways that we did this was to think about the importance of our worldviews and commitments. And what does it mean to actually embrace an anti-racist or decolonial ideological perspective when it comes to methods, right? Sometimes when we're talking about these commitments and we're prioritizing it, it makes sense, right, when we're engaging in it, but what does it actually look like to stay true to those commitments throughout the research process? So we were able to untangle that. The other aspect of the workshop that was really helpful and what I found to be particularly important, because at the time I was a graduate student, was you could create collaborations with faculty across university spaces. So graduate students were actually able to find support outside their departments. And then further, faculty could connect with students outside their departments as well. And so there was the ability to kind of work on projects, develop partnerships across campus. And additionally, folks were able to connect to different community organizations they were working with or to foster or develop relationships on partnerships that they wanted to prioritize. Oftentimes, faculty are nervous or don't feel like they have the ability politically to engage in community work. And so this gave the space and the permission to be able to develop those relationships. The part about the workshop that was really tangible when we're thinking about specific research methods around quantitative and qualitative work and inquiry is that you were able to work with folks who were able to rethink how do we integrate an anti-racist quantitative research approach within a community engagement process, right, or project. Similarly, what does it look like to engage in qualitative research approach where community folks are centered, right? And they're the experts. So one piece that a lot of faculty appreciated was this was the space where new faculty could create a research agenda that was anti-racist or decolonial from the very beginning. Similarly, faculty could pivot their research practices that were anti-racist in nature and prioritize that throughout the research process. So sometimes we did a great job methodologically when it came to developing research questions, but it wasn't so helpful when we were sharing our findings, and it was only being shared from journals and periodicals, but not being accessible for community members. The other piece is that we were able to prioritize the work with community partners. So we think about complications around funding, whose work is centered, navigating policies, or encouraging ways to not center Western approaches. This space gave the opportunity for us to get feedback from faculty who work with community partners, for graduate students interested in engaging with the community partners specifically around their research. And also what people found most valuable is that they could actually workshop their projects. So in the various phases of it, they could get feedback from graduate students and faculty in real time. So when they are creating these projects, they were able to pivot or shift it to be more inclusive in nature. The other thing is we were able to position community partner as equal in the knowledge creation project and the process. And so when we're thinking about the priorities of the book, I just want to say that this is the piece that I think that really mirrors some of the expectations. And then finally, you were able to create meaningful, right, in ways to include community members in the process. So we're working with the community instead of working on. So I want to say that. So one thing that was helpful is that we found that a lot of faculty members really talked about how they wanted to redesign, maybe specifically a post-positive approach on existing tools to be more nuanced, and they were interested in developing mixed methods approach and studies to engage in critical methodologies. The other thing is, instead of dictating what approaches that you're doing with community work and agencies, we're finding that the faculty were interested in more participatory methods that were inclusive in nature and centered participants. So when we think about creating and integrating community, these are just some of the ways that we were able to do that through the workshop. So I'd like to pass it off to Alicia to talk about our next section.
Okie dokie. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how the Anti-Racist Research Working Group kind of connected with our community at large. At the workshops, like Dr. Call-Cummings said, during summer 2020 with the killing of George Floyd, anti-racism seemed to be centered across university campuses. So this workshop was very popular among Mason faculty and students, not only in our College of Education, but kind of beyond that. And one thing that we were able to do was create a website, Anti-Racist Research Resource website. And on that website, we have resources breaking down from critical theories, reading lists for critical theories, anti-racism, decolonizing and indigenous research methods. And we also have a place up there where you can see recent work from people involved in the working group and similar works. Next, the Ardor Collective was established, and this was actually established this year in the spring. And the Ardor Collaborative is made up of faculty, staff, and students across Mason, and it was created to be a pipeline of revolutionary, anti-racist, and decolonizing researchers across disciplines. The group still hosts workshops kind of beyond that first How to Be an Anti-Racist Research workshop series, which our book chapter focuses on. Sharrell actually hosted a workshop last month where she was able to discuss her dissertation research and using participatory action research for her dissertation. In addition to that, we also now have a graduate certificate focusing in anti-racist and decolonizing research methods. And this, with the certificate, it gives students the opportunity to take courses that center anti-racism and decolonizing approaches. And we also had a couple of courses that came from these, from the workshop, such as we now have an anti-racist and decolonizing research capstone course. And now just ongoing connections and community building. Like Sharrell was saying, the breakout groups that we had during our original workshop series, students and faculty alike were able to discuss their research, make connections. Maybe you had a similar issue or maybe similar interests, and people were really able to connect and talk about how to further their research, kind of in a collaboration. And I believe now we are going to share the website. Some of the resources that we have, and Sharrell, did you put them in the chat? Okay. Handout, which just share some of our anti-racist and decolonizing research resources. I'm going to share the website, the plan for the collective, and the Arter Institute.
And Alicia, I wanted to just add a little bit about the handout. So with the handout, we have literature and scholarly research that's available. So when you're thinking about how do I create an agenda? If I'm thinking about doing this type of work, what are some of the scholars that have been doing this for a while that I can pull from as I think about ways to implement and advance my anti-racist and decolonial agenda? The other resource that we also wanted to provide is the one that Dr. Giovanni Dazzo created. I helped with the literature and scholarly research, but one thing I want to highlight is the beautiful work from Dr. Dazzo's work on the Anti-Racist Research Methods Individual Action Plan. And I don't know if we are able to pull that up, but if not, you have it in the link. What's so helpful about this, and Meagan, please feel free to add too, is that this will walk you through step by step. If I'm really interested in doing this work, how am I not doing it in a way that is tokenizing? How am I doing in this way that is authentic to the approach? And how am I doing it in a way that really looks at anti-racism from the beginning of looking at literature, thinking about my own positionality, and how can I implement this throughout the process? What Giovanni has so beautifully done is provided a series of reflection questions for you to take the time to go through and kind of answer. Also to be able to situate this within your current research practices, right? So it's not just how do I think about my own positionality, but how am I actually implementing that? And then for you to be able to look at the specific action. So describe what it is that you need to do, how you will do it, and the resources needed. And then finally, the last phase of this plan is what will you do to hold yourself accountable? So if you're looking at this, not only from the positionality, but also from the literature that you're using, right? How are you deviating from the canon or your traditional citation practices, right? That's something that I did within my own research, but takes a little bit of work, right? And for you to really be strategic about how are you creating, and this is something that Giovanni often talks about, is creating a list or a table of the identities of those that you cite. How does your literature center dominant hierarchies, right? And so how do we kind of abandon those pieces that we're most familiar with to start to think about how are we breaking the expectation around the Western research, right, canons that we're looking at? Also thinking about research design and questions and our methodology. How can like study tools be designed in ways that are culturally responsible? Similarly, when we think about our analysis and our interpretations, how are we contextualizing data? And then also thinking about ways that we're sharing our publication, right? How are we maybe sometimes disregarding ways that we can share our findings outside of the academy, right? How is our research and our practice and ways that we're working with community partners, how is it actually accessible, right? And so sometimes that means that we may need to reframe or rewrite what we're sharing in ways that can be more accessible, right? Outside of the expectations of the academy. And then the other piece, and Meagan, if I'm missing anything, feel free to add. But if you do use that, we are asking that you do cite Dr. Dazzo's work in creating that particular tool. But I do think it's like fabulous and a wonderful tool if you're thinking about community partners that you're working with. How are you starting and doing that? It's a really good also professional development opportunity to realign your work purposefully. And then the other thing that we did want to share in terms of a research for you or an opportunity is information around an institute that we host. And we've been able to provide as well. And, Meagan, feel free to hop in here as well.
Yeah, maybe while you're oh, you got the link up there. Great. I was just gonna say I could fill in for you a little bit, but that's fine. So, and so jump back in, Sharrell, as you want. So as part of this process of really identifying the gaps that exist in institutions of higher education, one of the areas of sort of concern that we identified was the sort of purposeful, intentional individualization of research in higher education, and the problem with feeling incredibly alone when you're doing this work, particularly when you're doing the work of anti-racist research in higher education. And so we developed together with our colleagues Amy Best, Kasim Davis, again, Rob Graham also, and many others, this Summer Institute in Anti-Racist and Decolonizing Research Methods that we call Revolutionizing Research for Social Change. It has now run twice, and it is an annual Summer Institute that is completely free except for travel. We have some funding, but not that much funding. We wish we did, but the goal is to really decrease barriers for attendance. And the central goal of the Summer Institute is to develop relationships among scholars who engage or want to engage in anti-racist and decolonizing research approach in their work, but often feel so, or are really truly so alone at their institutions, potentially, especially for graduate students, without mentors who are willing or able to provide support in this space. For early scholars, similarly, who may feel vulnerable going up for tenure or things like that, especially in areas that may be politically divided on these topics. And so for the past 2 years, and again this coming year we will, but for the past 2 years we have brought about 23 graduate students and a couple undergraduate students from across the United States, and indeed across the world. We've had several colleagues from across the world who have come and have worked over 1 week to do the hard relational work of developing a network of possibility. Sharrell, do you want to add?
Yes. So when I first started this, I was still a graduate student. And so one thing that works so well is that in 1 week, you have the opportunity to hear from scholars who are actually doing anti-racist and decolonial research. And they're sharing with you their process for analysis. They're sharing with you their process for developing a research agenda around a particular topic. And what most of the graduate students find to be so helpful is they have a plethora of ideas that they can enact and really shape the process of their research work. Additionally, with that relationship, these folks, they created group chats and they continue to be in contact and visit each other from California to Texas to Maine, right? And so they've been able to connect with each other and develop that scholarly work in terms of folks that are doing like-minded things around anti-racist research. And then also we've been able to kind of create a pipeline to be supportive as folks are interested in entering the academy. So what's so helpful is it's not just opportunity to think about research methods, but it's a way to develop connections and professional colleagues that you can continue to navigate your experience with. So what often happens is students are talking about real life experiences they have as BIPOC students, right, who are in an academic setting where it's maybe not as inclusive. And so to have your colleagues that can be supportive of you so that you can maintain, right, and persevere, so that way we don't lose folks like we sometimes do in the academy as a result of not having that support system. So that workshop is really helpful for folks. And a lot of times people are saying how that gave them the comfort, the motivation to continue to persevere. So we do want to say that if you know folks that are interested, we'd love to have them. And then also, if you're doing work and you think your work is worthy of sharing, we really look for ways that it's creative around sharing the research, but impacting change in communities. So we would be open to hearing from you if you would be willing to share something, even virtually, if you wouldn't be able to join us in person.
Yeah, I mean, the goal of all these different aspects of anti-racist and community engaged and decolonizing research methods is really to change the academy, to really uproot systems of white supremacy, of neocolonialism, and really shift the axis of academia to be one that is anti-oppressive, anti-deficit, standing against firmly narratives of damage and deficit, to one that is fully inclusive and liberating. And so we're excited about the work and also eager to hear others' examples across academia. So thank you. With that, I think we are ready for Q&A.
Super. Well, first of all, wow, thank you so much. That was so incredibly interesting. I forgot that I was even like one of the people on the panel, and I'm just like feverishly writing notes. And then like, oh, wait a second, I'm going to have to shift to facilitating the Q&A. That, even though Christina and I, worked with all of you on editing the chapter, I feel like I just learned just wealths of information that I now need to kind of go through. So thank you for that. We have several questions that I want to get to in the Q&A before we close out. The first question's a comment, but I'm going to kind of turn it into a question because I think it's interesting. And it says that I love how this project used the opportunities and funding opened by a specific moment to create sustainable structures that transcend the moment, particularly as a grad student. I appreciate the possibilities to get supported in doing this kind of work. Can you talk for a minute about how you got the funding? How do you go about securing this funding? I mean, this work is so important. I mean, you're shifting, frameworks and prioritizing and, shifting from going from focusing on the deficit of people to the deficit of structures, which is where our focus needs to be. How do you go about getting some of this funding?
Well, I think one of the first things, I mean, we could talk about how it was seed funding and it was like a simple proposal and things like that. But I think one of the keys, and Sharrell and Alicia, please feel free to jump in or add, was that all three of us, and indeed our co-authors as well, were already positioned to engage, to get funding, essentially. Sharrell had been working or was about to work on a task force. And so she was already like a known quantity at the university. Similarly, I had already been doing this work. Alicia had been working on this work as a graduate student and been working with Dr. Powell, who is a co-author, and Rob as well was my student at the time or just previous to the time. So not only we already knew each other, and we were already sort of known in the university. So as this interest convergence came to be, and frankly, white old men were like, hey, we should at least look like we're anti-racist, and we have some money to give out. It was sort of a no-brainer. And I think they pretty much came to us and said, let us support your work, essentially. And so one of the points that I want to make there is something that is overarching, or a through line or a thread or a theme or whatever you want to call it in our work, which is relationality. We had already built relationships where we trusted each other and others trusted us to do this work. And so that was key in receiving the funding that we did. Yes, they did come to us. There were like simple application procedures and things like that, that we did have to sort of write out our goals and things. But ultimately, it was really people already trusted us and trusted our work.
That's awesome. And it's great to have built the trust within institutions, something we all strive to do. The next question is, how can you find out whether authors are from minoritized backgrounds? Do you have tips to help find diverse sources? Any?
Yeah. So that Sharrell, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the fact that you're asking that question is an excellent start. And so what I think we could do, and very simply, is just start looking at the authors that are doing the work, right? And so I Google them, right? I look at the other research that they're doing. I'm looking at the progression of their research and their ideologies. Sometimes folks are doing work around a particular topic, and then they just slap on an anti-racist approach to it, and it's not really done authentically. And so it comes across as haphazard. So I take the time to look at the scholar's work, and if I recognize, like, oh no, they're doing Black feminist theoretical approaches throughout their research, that's been a priority for their research throughout. So then I recognize that this isn't just something that they're doing for this one-off project, but it's part of their epistemologies, their ontological perspectives. And I also just look up who they are, right? What's a picture? What does this person look like? How do they identify? What are their priorities? Is in looking up, institutions that they work in, their bios. So that's what I do. I don't know if Alicia or Meagan have other thoughts or ideas.
No, I was gonna say Google them. I think now that I Google just about everybody from the articles that are, especially articles that I like to read, just Google, learn work that they're doing, like, that they're sharing out, but also like what are they doing at their own campus and how are they like trying to impact change where they are.
And I will also say, as for those of you who are on the call, those of us who teach research methods or really anything, right? It's important to kind of model this approach in our own teaching, on our own syllabi. So not only making sure that we have the people on our own syllabi, but then introducing those, showing pictures, offering links to interviews, things like that of the people that we're including on our syllabi, just to model that approach in our classes as well.
Super, thank you. And I think that if you're a student on this webinar and you're not seeing that in your classes or in your research methods, ask for it. I mean, that's important because sometimes it's like, shoot, yep, I got to redo this. You're right. So ask. The next question, and this is a question that I also had in my head for some of us, is when will the dates be known for the 2024 week workshop? That workshop sounds amazing. Would you be able to share it with key officers and leaders at my institution, which was Kate Grace? I don't know what institution that is, though. But would you be able to share it, and then maybe we can share it out, because it looks like an excellent workshop.
It is excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Sharrell leads it beautifully. And I think we're looking at a couple different dates. Honestly, we're waiting to hear from housing and when the dorms are available. Yes, you stay in dorms. They're not the greatest, but they're free. So we will definitely make sure that we reach out via your listserv.
Thank you. And free is excellent. So that's great. And Emory is the institution. So thank you. And then there's a question that says, where does auto theory, or the exploration of theoretical and personal embodied experience with an emphasis away from objectivity, fit into anti-racist research?
Come on, Sharrell, that's you.
Well, I guess I would just say that when I first started doing my research and thinking about what I wanted to explore, I was like, I need to do something that's completely not connected to who I am and really remove myself. But I started to recognize that, as doing qualitative research, I'm an instrument, right, in doing this. And then also, how does my own positionality, who I am as a person, my ideologies around the world, right? How does that become centered in the work? And so as my project developed, I ended up creating my own, right, with the collective, because I did a participatory action project. With the collective, we created our own methodological perspective. And so I think, and it was very subjective, right? Our individual perspectives provided a very unique understanding of our experiences as first generation women of the African diaspora. So I think it's essential, right, when you're doing this type of work, to think about how are you fitting into this, right? And when we think about things being objective, isn't that counter to thinking about racism, right? When we're thinking about structures. So I guess that's how I would start answering the question. But Alicia and Meagan, how would you add? What would you say?
Yeah, I think really decentering, or I would say like questioning and disrupting the sort of like religious observation of so-called objectivity is really central to our work and central to a lot of the theories that we depend on. So feminist theory, Black feminist theory, and different epistemologies as well, and really engaging and engaging in a loving, embodied subjectivity that values who we are as people and the unique access that we have to and with other people and communities. That's really central to our work. So whoever asked that question, come to the Summer Institute and put in your application that you asked that question so we can make sure and accept you. I will say we have a lot of applicants and not many seats. So let us know that you were here and maybe you'll get in. But, anyway, yeah, this is great questions and great conversation. Alicia, did you have anything to add?
So I want to open it. We have a couple more minutes. Are there any other questions folks have that they want to put in the Q&A? So I'm just going to put out there. So for campuses that want to begin this work, so, they're driven and committed to doing anti-racist research. They've received some seed funding. What sort of advice would you give them? Maybe not the faculty, but center directors and centers for teaching and learning, for getting it going, for really incorporating this work into a campus culture, to really move a campus culture into more anti-racist. I guess we only have a few minutes for that, and I just got that warning.
So maybe each of us from like our unique perspectives
That'd be great.
can add. I would say from a faculty member's perspective, share the load, right? And make sure that it's spread across disciplines, across identities, across institutional hierarchies of power, because it's exhausting work. And it ebbs and flows with politics and interests and funding, and it just can be really exhausting. And so again, building relationships with lots of people who can support it and sustain it is crucial.
And I would say get with a group of folks that you can trust who are doing this work in authentic ways. So that way it doesn't become like co-opted into another agenda where folks are trying to elevate their work around what's new and sexy and the new trend around anti-racism, but rather that's authentic to and true to the principles. Once you have developed that smaller group, I think your goal is to see how you can expand your network. And so finding opportunities for graduate students to be a part of it, I think is also really centered, because they're doing a deep dive in the research. And so how do we prioritize graduate students in the process to keep the future, right, to advance the pipeline? I think is really helpful, because then they're leaving the institution and being able to spread that work. And then the other thing I would just say quickly is that be okay with not letting it become a big university initiative, because then the direction and the way that it goes might start to be disconnected with what your purpose is, right? And so it becomes a task force, or it becomes an agenda item that everyone's required to do. And so then that work looks very different, right? And it loses its essence of what it was supposed to be. And so be ready to have boundaries on when it needs to stay small and local versus to be really spread out as a larger institution initiative.
Yeah, and really quickly from the student perspective, I think I would just say, like, don't be afraid to use your voice and to connect out with professors or just other faculty member, because this work has always been something that I'm interested in. I maybe didn't have the name for it, for like anti-racism, but I feel like if I maybe would have been more open and like just maybe had better conversations earlier in my doctoral career, I would have, even if I wouldn't have been able to put a name to it until 2020, I think I would have been able to start doing my work in a more meaningful way if I would have had like these open conversations with not only faculty, but also like other doctoral students and peers.
Wow. Thank you for that last question too. Again, I started feverishly writing it down. I agree. It's really important, Sharrell, I just want to highlight not to make this the shiny object. It's so hard when you get something that all of a sudden gets funding, not to make it the shiny object at an institution. And you all are so correct that this work needs to stay mission specific and you know, and to the point of what it is intended to do. I can't thank the three of you enough. That was so interesting, so useful. I mean, from the beginning of how you talked about developing community amongst yourself so that you break down those power dynamics, which we speak about as being so critical to being broken down, to all the replicable practices you have given us that really are replicable, going to your website, but also the opportunity to join you in person if you apply and get accepted, to really learn how to do this work, because this work is important. And as Alicia just said, it's important to get it into the pipeline. It's important that I think it was Alicia, it might have been Sharrell, one of the two of you said, to get it into our pipeline. Our students, our grad students, our doctoral students need to be learning this work. And you're doing such phenomenal work at George Mason. It's so impressive. So I just want to thank you. I want to thank Christina, who has led this book, led this chapter, really for her colleagueship in all this work, and Campus Compact for really giving us this venue to highlight anti-racist community engagement, to get our book into practice, into publication, so that people can put it into practice. And we invite all the folks who are here watching to join us throughout the rest of the year for a series of workshops, virtual workshops just like these on principles 2, 3, and 4. So with that, those are my final words.
And I'll just say thank you. Cynthia, I think you did a wonderful job of wrapping us up. I want to go back and read the chapter again, only because like there's just so much wisdom that you all are able to share, and I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much. I'm going to dig into every link that you shared and think about how my methods can shift even a little bit more, because it is an effort, right? An ongoing, every research project effort. So thank you so much for your example. With that, I think we can say thanks everyone for coming. Meagan, Alicia, Sharrell, see you on the next round, right? That's what I do here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone. Take care.
Thank you.